Benny, what's going on, dude? You're finally coming on the QB Spotlight show. What an honor, huh? I mean, have you been waiting for this moment for years, huh?
It is an honor, I must say. I'm very excited, Steve.
Yeah. Have you? So ever since you admitted like Tom Brady was by far the best quarterback in the NFL history, have you decided who's number two right now? Like, do you have a number two quarterback of all time?
I don't remember ever saying that to you.
Interesting,
That
because I
he's the
do
best
remember
one,
that.
but
Uh,
I may have acknowledged that in some way to others, but I would never say that to you.
really, have you ever lied before in your life, or just never?
No,
Okay. Okay. So
never
that right
told
there
lie.
establishes the credibility. That's fantastic. That's good. Maybe we'll have to have some of our players come in and weigh in on that. But
Welcome.
everyone, yeah, no, we're definitely going to have them come in because I could have sworn I remember Tom Brady being the best ever coming out of your mouth. But anyways, we'll save that for another time.
Didn't.
Sincerely, Ben, thanks for coming on. Everyone, this is your first time tuning in. This is the QB Spotlight podcast. This is a place where we do quarterback content on a weekly basis. We got current and former quarterbacks that come in. We got current and former coaches that come in. We got quarterback trainers that come in. And this is our special guest for me, Ben Fairchild, who is in the sports performance field, the sports performance manager, strength conditioning coach, a lot of different titles, and has worked with a lot of high-level NFL quarterbacks, high-level college quarterbacks, MLB guys, NFL guys. We're in the same field. And so when I first got started, I was actually with Ben for most of my career. So anything positive or good that we've done in the training field is largely because of him. But I know he gets modest and embarrassed when we say that. But sincerely, we're excited to have you on. We're excited to talk quarterbacks. And today is going to be a little bit different because we're going to be talking about how do we train quarterbacks? How do we go about working with this special population that needs to be trained properly to rotate, but also needs to be trained properly to produce and absorb force with their shoulder and with their arm. So a lot of really, really cool dynamics that we're going to touch on it and talk about, especially with the training field now kind of almost shifting to like the quarterback training field is almost shifting to like where baseball shifted to 10, 15 years ago. It's a little more individualized, a little more specific. So we're going to get into that. But Ben, before we dive into it a little bit more, do you have any last sayings about the Tom Brady, Drew Brees debate that we've had so many years in the gym with all our guys, offseason, MLB guys, NFL guys, kind of everyone?
Yeah, I think it comes back to whether you consider quarterback a team position or an individual position. You know, if we're going to look at it strictly at statistics and maybe use longevity as kind of an averager, if you want to put things down to a per season basis, I think it's pretty clear who the greatest of all time is, Drew Brees.
Yeah.
But Tom Brady the Patriots won a lot of games, so he happened to be on that team, and I think that helps his cause tremendously.
Yeah, when you're up by 50 points, there's no need to pass a lot. When you're down by whatever the Saints are down by, maybe there's a need to pass a little bit more. But that's a whole, you know what we'll do? We'll take a tally. We'll take a vote with this and see who ends up becoming or being voted the best quarterback.
Not necessary, but
yeah. But real quick, Ben, I want to give your background just real quick so everyone that's watching can kind of know where you're coming from. So Ben's been in the sports performance industry for what, 20 something years, right? About 20, 25 years, give or take.
23 years now.
Yeah, and largely starting off in Louisiana, working with a lot of different pro athletes there, came to Houston, worked with a lot of different athletes here, and was known for the baseball where we would have, 40 guys in the MLB offseason at one point, including the online and in person. I know now it's a lot of football guys, but even when it was mainly baseball, there were still a lot of quarterbacks coming in, high school, college, and several NFL guys that came in that you worked with. So with that said, with all the specific individualization, going on right now, one of the factors that we'll both do when training quarterbacks is we'll go through this assessment process, right? There's different measurements that we like to assess that, we feel can benefit a quarterback tremendously. Can you kind of touch on that a little bit of like what you're measuring, what you're assessing, what you find valuable, and then maybe talk about once you do go through that assessment, how you implement that in the actual training, the workout, the warm-up, whatever it may be?
So the assessment process for any athlete is one that should be comprehensive, as you and I both understand and kind of ascribe to. What's so interesting about quarterback and why I can understand why it's your favorite position in sports, it's easily the most dynamic position in terms of the kind of the vast spectrum of athletic need, because basically you have a pitcher from an upper half perspective. Obviously, there's some mechanical differences which we can discuss, but from a lower half and from a kind of a reactive and competitive and leadership perspective, you've got a pretty complete power athlete, you know, in all other considerations but his arm. So you're really treating him as a complete athlete who also happens to pitch. Whereas with pitchers, no disrespect to pitchers, they're not complete athletes in a sense that they are purely dictatorial in their game. They're offensive. They've got one job. They're going to try to throw it to a spot at a certain speed, and they control everything. Quarterback is very unlike that. There's a lot of variables that happen once the ball gets snapped, before the ball gets snapped, that they have to adjust to. And the overall athletic requirement is so high, it might correspondingly require the most comprehensive assessment in sports, you know?
Yeah. What are some of those measurements? So like for me, some stuff I've been diving into is obviously, you know, with pitchers, a lot of external rotation that will measure in pitchers. But I've been finding that that's a huge measurement in quarterbacks as well, especially with throwing off platform, especially with like all these different throws that are going on in the pocket, outside the pocket. You're not throwing at the same angle, right? And so having that external rotation, you have more room to produce force, and generally the ball gets out a bit quicker with that. Could you kind of go into kind of how you assess that, your thoughts on that, and then maybe some shoulder care that you do depending on if they have mobility in the shoulder, if they lack mobility in the shoulder? Can I just touch on just external rotation in general as it relates to the quarterback position?
Sure. So I think, like you said, external rotation is going to be a big one because it kind of offers them a pathway through which they can load to exert force on the football to get velocity and spin it. That's critical. But beneath that, I think if we were to look behind external rotation, we're looking at more like scapular positioning. So does the scap posteriorly tilt on the rib cage? How is the scap sitting on a rib cage that may be malpositioned if the athlete is, for instance, rounded through their thoracic spine? So we want to look at posture. You know, when they're upright, are they able to get a more extended position in their spine where the scap can kind of sit back and offer that cradle of the scap allows for more perceived external rotation. So really, the assessment, in addition to the external rotation that you're mentioning, should really account for everything that's happening beneath the glenohumeral joint, the scapulothoracic joint, the spine, the rib cage, the pelvis, and then all the way down to the feet. So a good postural assessment, I would probably even place a level above, like you were saying, the external rotation, because it can offer maybe more insight as to why a shoulder is in pain or why it may lack external rotation or perceived external rotation because of the positioning that's happening beneath it.
Yep.
So all those things I think are important, and that's all for loading purposes. But as you know, that ball's coming out at, in cases, 70 miles per hour, which means probably an arm speed with a football of, I don't know, you would know better than
yeah. I want to say, so baseball is what, like if someone's throwing 90, 95, you're at like 7,500 range degrees per second. I think it's been up to 9,000, right? I think football is even coming fast. I think it's more like 1,500 degrees per second, 1,200 degrees per second. So still moving fast, but it's not that fast. It's because of the ball, right? Like,
right. But if it is 1,500 degrees per second, that's 4 to 5 full revolutions of an arm in 1,001 in that much time. So that said, once the ball is out, which is the moment of ball release or the moment of force delivery in any athletic realm, is going to be the highest speed moment in an action when the implement leaves the hand. So from that point forward, everything we talked about previous, external rotation, posterior tilt, those are all loading considerations, kind of creating a path to exert force. But once the object is gone, now we're looking at internal rotation, anterior tilt, scapular rounding, thoracic rotation in the opposite direction of the dominant arm. Those are all kind of force dissipation mechanisms and pathways, or kind of anatomical runway, like we used to say years ago. So I think all those considerations combined are important. It's not only the loading, but it's also what happens. It's not only the push, but it's the break.
So that's a great way to describe it. We've been able to train a few like high level quarterbacks out here who have gone on to the Elite 11. They do this like really cool breakdown where they're able to kind of measure max external rotation when they're throwing, And they have a few different routes. So like the bang route, like a post, or a go ball or a deep out. So anything that like considers like max effort, they've been measuring that. They measured hip and shoulder separation. They measure some really cool stuff, which I should probably just send you off air so you can look at it. You can probably
awesome.
find it fascinating. But it's the same measurements that we're talking about here and that we look for passively, or we look for when we're actually doing it. It's the same measurements, but now it's like an active game-like situation. You know what I mean?
Right.
And with that said, I want to touch on a few things with that. So off air, we were talking about injuries with quarterbacks, right? Something that, typically in football, even now, you still see, most of the time it's going to be contact for a quarterback. You're getting hit, you're falling on your arm, something like that, right? But we're seeing more and more some of these like soft tissue injuries, these non-contact injuries that are coming with quarterbacks. And I've always thought like quarterbacks are throwing now more than ever. They're throwing harder than ever. They're stronger than ever. They're rotating the hell out of their body. Like there's a lot of factors going on. And some of the injuries that we've seen in football are kind of foreign to quarterbacks or foreign to football players, like a lat injury or oblique injury, but something in baseball, or exactly like UCL, like something in baseball. Like if a player comes in to me or you and they have a lat, oblique, or UCL, it's like we see that all the time. It's like no big deal, right? So could you maybe touch on those three injuries, or if any of the injuries I missed, could you touch on those, why those get injured, and some considerations to have for a quarterback to hopefully, one, resist injury, and two, be able to perform at a good level?
Yeah. Well, one, I think you probably said it well with just you touched on like the volume and frequency and intensity of throwing has probably increased to a level. That's not something that's been tracked over time. It's very informal. But I think the fact that players are specializing more, a guy who might be a quarterback in football today, maybe doing that year round. You mentioned Elite 11, they're 7-on-7 teams. They're events and sort of circuits of play and kind of prospectus demonstration that are happening year round, so kids can get recruited. I understand the kind of the pressure to participate in those things, but with that may come a higher incidence of injury. I think thinking back to Stephen, for those of you who don't know, was an exceptional quarterback here in Houston and in an area in high school, and we can talk more about that later. But bottom line is, you also played other sports. You did things where you didn't have to rotate and throw, and therefore you pretty much avoided arm injury for the majority of your career. So, and went on to play college and had no problems there with your arm. So I think using that as a reference, just that generation of quarterbacks and my generation did not play quarterback, but my generation of football players played multiple sports. It's the bottom line. So if you were a quarterback on the football team, you might have been a point guard on the basketball team, which meant, 12 or 14 weeks of not motioning your arm at the advertised, 1,500 degrees per second. So that gave you the necessary rest when you may not have realized that you were sort of redlining or coming very close to crossing threshold. The downtime enabled you to recover fully so that by the next time you had to do that, you were prepared to do so physically. So I think that's as big a factor as anything. You could speak to it more because you really have your hand on the pulse of what's going on in the quarterback training industry, which is kind of a cottage industry within sports performance, like pitching is. But that has just kind of spun out of control now for the first time. Football really wasn't positionally differentiated in training until a very recent era. I think it came with social media, quite honestly, with the advent of like wide receiver training is the one that I see most, But all that to say, I think, like you said, volume of throwing, frequency of throwing, intensity of throwing is just at a different level than it ever was. And you couple that with not playing the other sports and having the downtime, it's a recipe for, injury.
Yeah. I think, man, that's a really good point. This, especially with the volume on top of volume on top of volume. Something that we've seen kind of out here is, and like a lot of good athletes who just haven't been exposed to it. Like when we go through maybe our first like shoulder circuit, where we do some like low trap, some like eccentric cuff work, get your serratus moving, get your scap in a good position, and the shoulders like on fire, like a band's killing them, right? And so that tells me, and that tells the athlete, like, hey, our cuff's probably fatigued. Our cuff probably hasn't had the type of stress we need to have if you're dying on the 5th rep of a banded external rotation. But with that said, it's crazy. Like there hasn't been a lot of exposure. And now there's getting more and more of exposure, right? With this type of training and mindset for quarterbacks. There's some really good trainers out there doing a really good job. But it's crazy. So there's a quarterback we've trained, and he's always had bicep tendonitis, some anterior joint pain in his bicep or in his shoulder when he starts throwing. And then this was his first year. He didn't play 7-on-7. He just got stronger. We really worked on like getting a good movement pattern. And now he goes out to rip the ball and he hasn't felt like any discomfort in his shoulder, right? So if we're comparing, which we could talk about this for hours, if we're comparing quarterbacks and pitchers, the amount of strength and exposure you need to protect the shoulder is going to be so much more in a pitcher than in like a quarterback, even with a quarterback who's throwing a lot these days or who's not taking a break, just because he's not throwing, his arm's not moving nearly as fast, right? And so I think this, even a little bit of exposure to shoulder care or a little bit of exposure to some preventative thought processing movements can go a long way for a quarterback. And so I want to talk about some, we don't have to name any names. I don't want to name any names, but I know you've worked with several NFL quarterbacks. Can you maybe touch on how different things were, 10 years ago, training these guys, even farther down that when you were training these NFL quarterbacks? You talk about how the training has changed a little bit. And I don't even know if it's changed that much for you because you've been so ahead of the time using specific med ball movements. Just kind of the philosophy of training. These quarterbacks are training like baseball players, watching you train these guys. I remember that. So could you touch maybe a little bit on how you trained them back then, maybe how it's evolved a little bit, and just like that thought process in general?
Yeah. Well, the main thing that stands out is that it's significantly more competitive now than it ever was. I think it was very easy, if you were a thinking person, to differentiate yourself and the service you provided a decade ago, particularly in football. Baseball has always been a half step ahead of football a half step ahead of basketball in terms of maybe the cerebrality with which they're programming and assessing. But with quarterbacks in particular, if you had a baseball background at that time, if you worked with pitchers, you could probably offer some additional value for the actual throwing arm. Whereas previously they would just kind of be pushed off to the side in the team setting, and they might do some, throwers 10, some external rotations at most, not really being taught, a mechanical approach to strengthening their arm. Now I think it's just everything has taken a step forward. We do have kind of this weird conjoinment of quarterback coaches and pitching coaches now becoming strength coaches, where their background, their academic expertise lies nowhere near kinesiology in cases, but they really understand throwing mechanics. You see it most so in pitching now, of course. But, outfits that focus on velocity and trying to maximize that factor now are having to account for health, because teams are now more aware and realize that keeping players healthy is what's most important. But you're starting to see kind of this, hybrid quarterback coach or pitching coach who's also a strength guy for that position. And that presents some concerns to me, just like a strength coach who doesn't understand a throwing motion would present some concerns. I think we have to be careful as players in how you choose that person. But the blending of the two is almost necessary, I think, because in the end, it's such a skill-laden position, throwing the football, that you have to have a pretty thorough understanding of throwing mechanics with your strength background to be able to ultimately transfer things over, So there aren't a lot of people, for instance, like you, that have that are fully 100% passionate about throwing the football and understand that deeply because they've spent decades doing that, and also have the academic prowess with exercise physiology coupled with the experience of working with high-level athletes. There ain't 5 of them in the country. You know what I mean? They're just – so I think – important for quarterbacks who are trying to find expertise that can both prevent injury, which I would label number one if they have any talent, and improve performance or sustain it. You really need to be looking for those factors in a quarterback coach / strength coach. And Maybe
No.
it's one guy. I really don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. Not to cut you off, but it's something we definitely see, and something that we've been fortunate to connect with a lot of some really good like quarterback coaches out here. Like I can speak the quarterback position, I can speak the biomechanical terms, but there's some guys that can actually like coach how to get a guy to throw a lot better. So some really good guys that we've been able to connect with, and like you mentioned, it's that blend approach where this quarterback coach, like whenever we're talking to any of our players, pitching coach, or medical staff, it's like, hey, we see X, Y, and Z whenever he swings, and we're like, great, we can add B, C, and F in here to help X, Y, and Z when he swings. Same thing with the quarterback coach and having that relationship. There's also some really good PTs like out here in Austin that we've been able to connect with that do a really good job with quarterbacks. And so it's and you've talked about this before, it's creating that team environment, creating that team approach. And so it's now shifting the quarterback position, because you've always had pitching coaches, right? Hitting coaches. You've always had it. Now you have quarterback coaches who now, if they share that same belief and philosophy, you can kind of blend that approach together. I mean, hell, we even have like really good DB coaches, like specific coaches out here that we can kind of blend that process together with. So I think that's one way it's changed, right? And it's becoming more individual and more specific. Do you think there's a point where it can be too individualized? Like you can be like too specific, like you can like really focus too much on the motion, as opposed to like, if you get powerful and explosive, you can rotate really well and you have strength to decelerate, you're probably gonna be able to throw the ball pretty good, right? So is there a happy medium with that, you think? Is it player specific? Like, there's probably not a right answer, but.
No, that's a great question. That to me is where like a thorough assessment comes into play, because it's for me, an assessment process is a needs discovery effort. Like we're trying to figure out exactly what he needs. And in cases it is skill. You may have a player who's too weight room focused and doesn't spin the ball very well, and he needs to spend a lot of time with a skills coach working on drill work. And then you got the other case where a kid's just naturally gifted and he can spin it, but he's not going to be big or strong enough for it to transfer to the next level. He's got to be a complete athlete. So yeah, I think it's just being able to evaluate and really kind of pinpoint what needs are is what's going to differentiate a player's program over time. But yes, to answer your question, you can go too far in the specific direction and lose sight of the generality of just being a great athlete, trying to beat 11 guys on the other side.
Right. No, that's great. And you mentioned earlier in the podcast about just how the upper body is doing one thing for the quarterback, but the lower body is more of that reactive in nature, more dynamic, more stuff going on, like the athletic part, if you will. And it's so different. Like for baseball players, right? It's you're reacting to a ball. If you're a hitter, if you're a pitcher, then you aren't really reacting. You're in control. Like you're shoving. You know exactly what you're doing. Quarterback is in control up here, throwing, reacting another place, and then transferring the force through here, all having to do it efficiently. So it's an incredible position to watch, because you have the combination of a rotational athlete and an overhead athlete, right? So, and like you mentioned, one quarterback may need more rotational focus, but also to your point, you also touched on if a quarterback can't rotate very well, but he's strong, then he's limiting. So he needs to work on that rotational aspect. So he has the platform, the plane to produce force. If a quarterback just works on rotating and just works on being able to move up, there's no strength and power and force in that, the ball is probably not going to jump out like it could, right? So have you dove into any kind of important like movement assessments with quarterback? Is it more passive in nature? Is it a blend of both? Or is it just like the pure athletic assessment that you kind of value, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think with a quarterback, you can get away with a much more like mundane, kind of streamlined athletic assessment, like you might with a football player, because the movement is much more quick and concise, as you know. Whereas with pitching, it's such an elongated, elastic, really range of motion requiring effort that, like, it's just hard to get the job done well for long in pitching if you don't have certain passive range of motion attributes, because you're going to load passively and then, deliver actively. And without those passive pathways available to you, you're gonna struggle to find it. So I think, yes, the pitching assessment can layer over an athletic assessment for a quarterback. Golf can also be thrown into that conversation. That's also something that we really enjoy working with. All three are very rotational in nature, but I would argue pitching is the highest complexity. Football is the most athletic. Golf is the most precise. In those three rotational movements.
Yeah.
So
that's a great breakdown. Do you can you talk about the rotation? Like so actually, can you talk about some of the anti-rotational factors and importance of things? Right, like we briefly talked about in the beginning of the episode. We talked about we're seeing some lat injuries. We're also seeing some oblique injuries. If you just practice on rotating, then nothing is focused on absorbing and decreasing the force you're producing. So, and oblique injuries is something that we've seen a lot in baseball, right? Mostly hitters, but even some of our pitchers, it's something. So can you talk about maybe why obliques get injured, even if it's from the baseball standpoint, and then maybe translate it to why a quarterback could injure an oblique and the importance of this anti-rotational work in general?
Yeah. So you touched on oblique injuries, and with pitchers in particular, we've seen the statistics, 4 out of 5 core injuries in baseball, or take that back, 4 out of 5 injuries that are labeled as core injuries for major league pitchers are contralateral oblique injuries. So for your right-handed pitcher, it's your left oblique. Well, that is kind of it's rotational and propulsion, but it's anti-rotational isometrically. So when you think about like hip-shoulder separation, you mentioned an assessment of that earlier with the Elite 11, kind of how well they separate. That's the mobility factor. But then to motor back through that, I have to link the upper half to the lower half and use kind of isometric capability, which would be for us, like an anti-rotational hold or a peel-off press, maybe in a second phase. But you can reposition the upper and lower half and stagger them. You can be rotated while you do an isometric. Those are things that allow the athlete to kind of grab the upper half while they're producing force with the lower half and transfer well. But if you lack that kind of isometric or holding capability with the oblique musculature, that's where you're really going to kind of get overloaded at transition. And then the injury threat is really when the hips maximize separation and you start to go into your concentric or your push with the baseball or the football. Football, I think, again, it's not overly threatening. If I went out and threw 50 passes, as hobbled as I am right now, I can tomorrow I'll probably wake up feeling fine. If you ask me to throw 50 max effort fastballs right now off of a mound, something's going to give likely, so it's such a more less athletic movement, but a much more range of motion intensive and just a tougher move overall.
Yeah. And it's a faster movement. It's the fastest movement in sports, right? Pitching a baseball. Right. Like it's incredible. And
internal rotation.
Yeah. And you're doing it over and over again. It's like you're max efforting an approach 100 times a game if you're a starter. But even as a quarterback, the ability to produce force quickly and efficiently is powerful, right? So it's like if we want to, I think quarterback is such a blend of how we've trained hitters and pitchers, right? Such a blend and a mix, but there's a more athletic component on it because you're training them how to move and you're training them a little bit differently. But with that said, we have like elite pitchers are throwing, I don't even know how fast. It's like 0.00 something seconds, right? You may know off the top of your head. You have elite hitters. At the time it takes to swing is like 0.2 seconds or something like that. And then elite quarterbacks, the release time is going to be like 0.35 and under, 0.4 and under is going to be like an elite.
When they start the motion.
Exactly. So even though like the baseball side is a little bit quicker and faster, it's still pretty damn fast for a quarterback. And you'd be able to boost force really, really quickly, really, really powerfully, right? So I'm interested to talk about maybe some of your approach and training of how you get the quarterbacks to produce force quickly and efficiently, right? So for example, like a lot of stuff we'll do, similar stuff with baseball is different pat methods, different bounds, different explosive stuff, but while still pairing that with a movement or with a structured event where like you have to be able to move through that movement pattern efficiently. You can't just be short just to go powerful, and you can't be short just to go explosive, right? It has to be a full range of motion, quick and powerful. So you maybe talk about the training side of how you get guys to efficiently move quickly, fast, and explosively.
Yeah. I think like skill mimicry is a big way to get that. So except that in a med ball setting, the cueing is everything. So as you know, you're an experienced coach. Two coaches could coach the same exercise differently, and it turns into two completely different exercises. So, for instance, if we were working on like rotational velocity as a system, but it's not an actual football throw, it's apart from skill, we'll probably cue them to rotate as fast as they possibly can and try to push this ball through the wall. If we're doing something as simple as like a med ball rotational slam, and remind them this is an exercise for speed. It's not a beauty contest for throwing the football. In other words, like we're trying to push this ball as hard as you possibly can. We need to get a little bit sloppy with it if we're going to get the neural effect that we want. So that's one way to do it. But I think also breaking down the component pieces of the movement itself, like that's a systemic kind of skill mimicry that's you're encouraging them to rotate as fast as they can. It's somewhat familiar because they throw a football. But if you just look at like external rotation of their drive leg and break that into two pieces, an external rotation of the hip is simply an abduction and an extension combined, and that creates external rotation in their hip. So you can work drills where you're, like you mentioned, bounding into abduction. You know, you're using hip abduction to bound laterally, simple lateral bound. And you can also do, you know, broad jumps or things on or linear bounds where they're extending, and then combine the two and go into like, you know, an actual drop step rotational jump, you know, something where it more simulates the lower half in the throw. If they're throwing deep downfield and they needed to gather up, that's something you could, you know, implement to get their lower half trained in a way that generates more speed without having the delicacy of skill, you know, where they're having to kind of gear down a little bit. So but I think so much of the art of that is in the coaching itself, because if I'm not a kind environment is one that explains clearly and expectations are understood. So if I say to the athlete, hey, I want you to throw this like you throw a football, am I going to get 110% effort? Of course not, because they're going to be more delicate with it. They want to be pretty, and it's got to be a spiral, and they got to be on time. But if I say, I want you to break this wall, you know, with this med ball, and I want it to look ugly, now they get the idea. They need to rotate faster than they ever have, you know. So I think the exercise selection is one piece, and I think you know, we can send somebody an Excel spreadsheet as we've done many times. But if we're not there to kind of cue them and manipulate their approach to this set of exercise, the outcome is kind of in the air. You know, we can't expect that we're going to get the desired result without really guiding them through that process pretty closely.
I think you mentioned some like two really good points there. What was one, you have a drill that isn't movement specific or isn't skill specific. It's power, like a broad jump. I want you to get as far as you can. I don't want you to think about throwing a football. I want you to produce as much force as possible and get out there. And then maybe over the phases, the off seasons, the weeks, you're kind of getting more and more specific as they're kind of owning different movements. Now maybe they're getting specific with some type of med ball rotational hip drive or something, right? Where it's like mimicking or getting really close to mimicking the skill they need to be able to produce force at, right? So it's like produce force really good. As you own each movement, you get a little bit more specific with the actual skill you need to be. And that's for more high level guys. Like if a younger athlete's coming in and hey, we just need to get explosive, you know, like, and then you can find the pattern to get explosive in. But with that said, man, we could talk about this for, did you ever watch did you see that quarterback documentary that came out
I did on Netflix? Yeah.
Yeah. You were able to watch it?
I was. Yep.
What did you think about? I thought it was fascinating seeing Patrick Mahomes and his trainer Bobby Stroop, who some of our guys have gone up there before, but seeing like the dedication, the specific nature of training, and then I also thought it was cool seeing Kirk Cousins and what he does to take care of his body. It's like really cool insight to see. Could you touch on that? Was that like a
I know Bobby, and I've had a good experience with him on several occasions with common clients and things like that. They were, of course, as you know, in Texas and originally. And I think their approach was interesting. I enjoyed the fact that it's so far outside the box, because I think it mirrors, you know, Mahomes' style of play.
Right.
And I only enjoyed it because after to asterisk that with just because he's got so much experience with that individual athlete. On the surface, I would not like that at all. I would say, like, you know, this is, you know, he's making things up, you know, in terms of like exposure to strange stresses and weird positions. This is experimental, but I love it because he's worked with this athlete since he was a teenager, and he really does trust and understand his response to a conventional setting. And now kind of more observant of his play style, now he's able to kind of, create exercises that arguably, kind of build a tolerance to certain weird positions that he gets in that maybe the average guy doesn't. So I thought that was fascinating, and I really enjoyed that. I can't recall clearly what Cousins' preparation process was. I may have missed that part, but
he was more of like having people just come over to the house and work on his body and just some soft tissue work.
I do remember that.
But yeah, no, I thought it was, I'm right with you. I thought it was fascinating. Like, there's a reason why, he's one of the best out there, because he's able to think like this and able to get his guy in a good position. And you're right, he knows his quarterback so well. I thought it was really cool to watch, not just the science behind things, but then also like Mahomes's like dedication and that specific nature. I'll do whatever it takes to get ready. He trusts his guy, right?
Yeah, exactly. On that note, because I was just thinking, you also have to credit their relationship heavily with kind of the success and the kind of the outcome of the program, because without that trust from the athlete, he doesn't have the liberty to experiment the way he has, because he probably has. There are probably a lot of coaches that are in that position that may have ideas, but they don't yet have the full buy-in of the athlete. And if they do something unconventional, they could lose the athlete. So it says a lot about their relationship, and I think that's beautiful. I think that enables him to kind of flourish as an artist to help Patrick achieve what he needs to achieve. You take that out of the equation, that decade-long relationship can grow and evolve, and they can the trainer can express ideas and kind of get feedback and gauge Patrick's openness to it. But yeah, that's pretty cool.
That's a good point. It was fascinating, and it speaks a lot to like this field and the buy-in, the trust, relationship, like the fact that Patrick is so bought in. Now he's able to maximize his performance ability because he's trusting his trainer, who's doing a hell of a job. And so I think you probably get that trust with more high-level guys when you're able to go one-on-one. It's hard whenever you have like 10 guys that you're working with.
No question.
But with that said, Ben, I do want to play like a fun little game maybe we can dive into, unless you have anything kind of like on a more serious note you want to touch on as it relates to training quarterbacks, anything that we missed, kind of big.
But I do think one good point to mention, I think when training if there are young coaches out there that are trying to get into training, and particularly quarterbacks, I think the fundamentals of coaching sometimes are innately understood if you're good with people and you kind of have an interactive way. But so often what I see now with kids relatively coming out of school is just the art of actually coaching is sometimes not, the path to that is not appreciated. It's often you understand certain fundamentals about exercise and how the body responds to it, but you just touched on it with Bobby Stroop and Patrick Mahomes. The relational component cannot be circumvented. It can't be microwaved or fast forwarded. The athlete has to trust you, and you have to earn that trust by, genuinely caring about their outcome and them as a person. You can't fake that. So I just think that part of it is an important message for young coaches that think it's all about the acquisition of knowledge. But the biggest piece of the equation is how you relate to people. Do you respect people? Do people, find you to be kind? Do they think you have your best interest at heart? The world is yours once people know that about you, because then your knowledge matters to them. The old, no one knows, cares how much you know until they know how much you care, is so true when it comes to coaching, because I just think, and those relationships take time. It's just, you have to, really stick to it to get people to trust that you care about them. So that part of the equation just can't be sped up. And I think it's important for young coaches to kind of recognize that it's not just what you possess in knowledge, because experience will outweigh textbook knowledge 10 times, So You have to
No,
allow the time to pass to accumulate that and put your athletes in a safer position. So
that's a good word. That's a good advice to younger coaches and trainers. So usually we ask, I'll go ahead and ask you anyways before we play this little fun game, but usually we'll have our guests, and most of the guests are, current and former quarterbacks, coaches, all that stuff. And we always ask them to give advice to quarterbacks. So right there, you just gave advice to like younger strength coaches, sports performance coaches, whatever they call us these days, right? You gave that advice to them. And I think it was heavy with like the relational aspect is numero uno, and everything else is going to follow that, experience and relationships. That's number one. With that said, do you have any quick words any advice to actual quarterbacks that you'd want to give? Let's call the kid a border D1 guy in high school, pretty good quarterback. What one piece or two pieces of advice would you give to him to elevate his next game? Come train at FSP, but besides that, what would that one advice be?
Yeah. Get an assessment, a thorough assessment from a local expert. If there's no one locally that you can trust, find someone nationally that you can travel to, because it's just like it's hiking without a compass if you don't have an assessment. We just talked about this a moment ago and looked at the textbook definition of assessment, and it was kind of like it was described as the process of creating a judgment, and it's like if you don't take the time to do that, if you don't identify your exact needs or what's holding you back from being that Division I prospect, how are you ever going to address it and get better? So I think so often with athletes, there is such maybe a misplacement of energy. You see so many athletes, even at the high school level, they've gotten that far because they love it and they're committed, but if you could just harness that energy in the direction that a assessment, for instance, provides, then your training is not going to waste. So being able to identify what your weaknesses are and train to strengthen them is probably the fastest path to elevating your status as a prospect.
That's a good word, man. I think if you want to be as great as you possibly can or go as far as you can, then there's no excuse big enough to keep you from finding a way to do that. And so I think having that assessment is a big step in doing that. With that said, though, let's move on to a little bit of a lighthearted approach or talk combo. So if you like this video, real quick, like, subscribe, all that YouTube stuff. We put out quarterback content on a weekly basis. We're going to get to a little more kind of personal fun stuff. So if y'all want to X out, but if you're one of our ball players or someone we've trained, y'all might want to stick around. So first round draft pick. You need a quarterback. Out of any of the guys that we've trained together or somehow have been together, who are you taking as a first round pick quarterback?
Amongst our Major League Baseball clients?
Amongst the Major League Baseball clients, yeah. Major or in minor, major and minor league baseball clients. But yeah, professional
a lot
baseball.
Of high school quarterbacks, actually.
There were. Yeah, you might offend a few too.
That's a pretty easy one, Steve. Cole Stewart.
100%.
Yeah.
100% Cole Stewart, right? Oh my gosh.
Division I.
Yeah. But there were a few others. Okay, what about if you need a dual threat quarterback? Who are you taking?
Dual threat amongst our historical MLB clients. Dual threat quarterback. Ooh, JB Shuck.
JB Shuck.
Jack
okay,
Shuck.
He's gonna find a way to.
Chicago White Sox.
He's gonna find a way to get it done.
Averaged 30 points as a point guard in high school. One of the best all-around athletes we've worked with. Two-way player.
He had a Division II offer to go play basketball, I think.
Yeah.
You remember when he hit that home run in Houston? Like, this was probably 2015, 14, 6, whatever. And you went and found it, and you like bought a jersey to trade it.
That's right.
All right. What about take Cole Stewart out of the equation? Just a pure pocket quarterback, just like a guy like you don't care about running. Like he can't run, but like he's gonna rip it.
Amongst the baseball players. Gosh. I trust Mark Melanson. I think he's
I can see that. Yeah.
He's a good decision maker.
Yep.
Strong enough arm. And another high school quarterback. You might have offended him that he's not a dual threat guy. Who's that?
What'd you say?
I mentioned Joe Savory as a backup as well. Another high school quarterback.
So he's the backup to Mark Melanson, right? Joe Savory is the backup.
So. I mean,
Okay.
neck and neck, going to camp, fill it out.
Would you announce it a week before the game or not announce anything until like right when they're jogging off to take that first snap?
I think you let them battle it out. Maybe one starts one preseason game, the other starts the other, and then
But you got your mind made up. You're picking Mark Melanson.
Monday of the week one, you announce it though. You don't let it drag on.
What kind of quarterback is Anthony Rendon going to be?
Great athlete. He's going to be more your dual threat. Yeah.
Is he going to study the playbook? What do you think?
I think at this age, I think he would, his sport came so naturally. I think he probably didn't have to overemphasize study, but I think if he's in football, he's a winner. So
if he study the playbook. I've told this to him before. If he grew up playing any other sport, he'd still be a professional athlete in that sport. Like if he grew up just playing quarterback, he's a quarterback.
Yeah.
I mean, best golfer we've trained.
Maybe quarterback. I think
I got him.
I would say, and Anthony knows how much I respect his athleticism, but I would say slot receiver. He could have played in the NFL, and he could have world class boxer.
Yeah. Good point. Rotates quick.
Quickest hands I've seen. World class boxer.
Yeah. I'm surprised. I'm surprised you're not going to pick old Rob as a dual threat quarterback, a little lefty, similar to JB, got a little more size, maybe put his shoulder down a little bit.
I thought about Rob, but I see him more as like a safety / receiver.
I can see that. Yeah, a little like Wes Welker kind of deal.
Yeah, exactly.
What about Strip? I know he was a good high school football player at Southlake. Yeah.
I could see him in a backup role as the shot caller. I could see that.
Yeah, is he a dual threat guy, a pocket guy? I think he's a
pocket guy. Yeah, he can move more of a Burrow type. If he needs to run, he can.
Yeah, that's a great.
Josh Allen, but
yeah, it's a great comparison, man. What about? We gotta give a shout out to Duffy, huh? What kind of quarterback is he? He's just gonna wake up and just sling that thing, huh?
He's gonna be a shotgun, just sit back there and throw it 50 times a game. Good guy.
He's Texas Tech tips fine. He's just going to sling that thing. Is anyone else that I know? There's so many other guys we're missing. Anyone else that played quarterback that we?
I'm sure it's like a lot of those good athletes in the other sports happen to play quarterback at young ages.
Yeah,
it's often considered your best athlete on the field. So
right,
I think if they were good enough in another sport to go pro, baseball in particular, they probably played quarterback.
Yeah, that's a good point. Man, I know there's a few other guys that we've talked to.
For sure.
We've given quarterback lessons to all those guys, but they just chose baseball instead. So awesome. Ben, real quick, thanks again so much for coming on and talking about just training quarterbacks. We should do this a little more often and talk about maybe a bit more specificity with things. Can you real quick just kind of tell everyone where to find you, social media, where the gym is, all that stuff?
Yeah, so FSP, we're in year 11 now here in the heart of Houston, and same location, 11 years, and online FSP training or FSP _ training on Instagram and maybe Twitter, definitely Facebook, and yeah, that's it.
Yeah. What about your profile? What about
my name? I think my Twitter checked it recently and it got taken offline, so I don't know what happened, but
how'd that happen?
I don't know. I got suspended. I don't know if I don't even participate often, so
we'll have to try to
look into it. But
I'll have to try to find a way to get that unsuspended. But you have Instagram, right? Or is it just FSP Instagram?
I do have Instagram as well. Yes, it's my name. So
okay. You want me to tell people your middle name, or want me to keep that private?
That's okay. Yeah, we can save that. Yeah, I appreciate it.
All right, man. Well, man, this was so much fun.
Great catching up, Steve.
We'll keep this. Yeah, we'll do this again. I'm gonna put this out there, and I'm sure our guys will get a kick out of this last like 7-8 minutes that we talked about. Maybe someone will get offended, get mad at you, not me.
Probably.
But with that said, hey, if you like quarterback content, this was a little bit different. Thanks for watching. Please tune in, like, subscribe, all that YouTube podcast jargon, whatever else they say. We'll see y'all next time. Peace.
Awesome. Thanks.